he's going to play the fear card. And I think he's going to play the fear card really big. And to the extent that there's economics, it won't be the kind of economics we're talking about. It'll be weaved in with fear, right? If we lose control, right, it'll be a disaster. The economy will tank. We'll have woke policies. You'll be unemployed. You name it. It'll be fire and brimstone. We have it. So I think that's what he's going to do. I don't think it's going to have anything, very little, to do with economics. I think he'll see what happens, and obviously he makes his adjustments. But no, I honestly do not think they really take economics of the sort we're talking about seriously. I don't think they fundamentally believe in markets. I don't think they fundamentally believe in government. I think it's sort of a nihilistic approach that will.
So did you just watch this? Did you see what this economist just predicted? And here we are facing this naked truth that they're basically admitting they're not even going to pretend anymore. And I want you to understand what you're witnessing, because less than a year from the midterm elections, state and local voting officials from both major political parties are actively preparing for the possibility of interference by the Trump administration. And this goes so much deeper than you realize, because we're not just talking about policy differences or campaign tactics here. We're talking about the systematic weaponization of psychological terror as statecraft and Trump's lagging poll numbers and what has become an unpopular tariff-dominated economic policy have some Republicans concerned that both chambers could be at risk. So you have to grasp what happens next in this calculus, because when authoritarian movements smell their own potential defeat, they don't moderate, they escalate, and what this economist is describing is not hyperbole, it's the actual playbook, and you need to understand the philosophical architecture behind it, because we're witnessing something that political theorist Hannah Arendt warned us about decades ago when she wrote about how totalitarian movements function, not through coherent ideology, but through the constant generation of unreality and existential panic. It is Trump's attempts to control parts of the electoral system, combined with the big lie, which gives Trump's movement the motive and ability to ensure elections are neither free nor fair in 2026. And I need you to sit with that for a moment, because this isn't some distant authoritarian country, this is happening right here, right now, in real time. The economist in that clip said something profoundly chilling when he noted they don't fundamentally believe in markets, they don't fundamentally believe in government, and he calls this nihilistic, and that term is so precisely correct because Trump is an opportunist exploiting a nihilist moment of moral despair and cultural disorientation to install an anti-liberal value system that many millions perceive as a cure for nihilism itself. And you see, this is the trap. This is the psychological mechanism that fascist movements have always deployed throughout history, where they manufacture the chaos and then position themselves as the only possible answer to the chaos they themselves created. Scholars say the U.S. has slid into some form of authoritarianism that is relatively mild compared to some others, and certainly reversible. But we are no longer living in a liberal democracy, and the fact that hundreds of political scientists are sounding this alarm should terrify every single person who cares about the survival of democratic institutions, because these are not partisan hacks. These are people who have spent their entire careers studying the erosion of democratic norms across the world. What makes 2026 absolutely critical, and why the economist's prediction is so devastatingly accurate, is that the groundwork is already being laid for conflict in the 2026 midterms, from new voting restrictions and legal challenges to the ways political leaders are reshaping the systems that govern elections themselves. And you need to understand what we're actually talking about here, because Trump's administration has elevated to prominent government roles numerous people who have a history of spreading false information about elections, and local officials worry their message may be drowned out by those with much bigger megaphones. And this is textbook competitive authoritarianism, where you don't need to cancel elections, you just need to corrupt them sufficiently that the outcome is predetermined. As the 2026 midterms approach, that effort will likely gather momentum, including attempting to rewrite election rules to burden voters and usurp control of election systems, targeting or threatening election officials and others who keep elections free and fair, and the Brennan Center is literally documenting this in real time as a concerted strategy, not as scattered incidents but as systematic institutional capture. And here's where it gets even more disturbing, because Trump has invoked presidential emergency powers more frequently than any other modern president, and Trump ally and attorney Clayton Mitchell has broached declaring a national emergency as a strategy to enact election changes. And just pause on that for a second, because we're talking about weaponizing emergency powers to override state control of elections. Trump's former advisor Steve Bannon said on his War Room podcast that he hopes immigration and customs enforcement agents are patrolling polling places in the midterms, which would be clearly illegal, but that's precisely the point, because heavy vehicles on the streets and checkpoints and soldiers or guardsmen make it hard to get to election places, and that inconvenience can keep people from voting, especially in a midterm where people are not as motivated, and all of these little bits on the margin can start chipping away at how many people are willing or able to cast their votes, and this is the architecture of voter suppression through intimidation. And you don't need jackbooted thugs breaking down doors, you just need enough ambient menace to depress turnout in the communities you want to silence. The economics angle that The Economist mentioned is particularly insidious because as the president's second term crosses the 10-month mark, the unemployment rate is worse, inflation is worse, the national debt is worse, and even the trade deficit is worse, fueling sustained chatter about the nation's Trump slump. And after promises of day one results fell through, the administration has started pointing to the late summer of 2026. Some of President Trump's closest allies in Congress are warning that the party needs to sharpen its affordability message to voters heading into the 2026 elections or risk big losses. But here's the brutal calculus, and this is what that economist understood so clearly. When you're presiding over economic failure and you know you're going to lose on the merits, you don't pivot to better policy, you pivot to pure fear. As 2025 comes to a close, Republicans are fighting against a tide of unpopularity, especially around the economy, and the president faces record-low favorability rating, so the question becomes how do you hold power when the public has turned against you? And the answer throughout history has always been the same. You construct an external threat so overwhelming that questioning the leader becomes tantamount to national suicide. Listen to what The Economist said again, because he's describing a campaign that will be weaved in with fear about woke policies, about unemployment, about total disaster if we lose control, and a leader emerged who understood the fear and humiliation felt by his public, validated their rage, and focused blame on a scapegoat, pledged to make the nation whole again, to return it to its rightful glory, and much of the population suffering profoundly from the shock of loss and change and insecurity embraced the leader as a sort of messiah. And experts who have studied the political and economic history of Europe trace dramatic and deeply troubling parallels between that era, a century ago, and this fraught American moment. As in Europe after World War I, there's kind of a disdain for democracy, a willingness to think of going beyond the technicalities of a democratic system in order to solve problems, a longing and respect for strong leadership that many believe is lacking in a standard liberal democracy, and UC Berkeley historians are not in the business of making inflammatory comparisons lightly. These are scholars who understand that fascism emerges not from a vacuum, but from specific material conditions of economic precarity, cultural dislocation, and elite panic about losing power. The nihilism piece is absolutely crucial to understand, because some call these maneuvers authoritarian, but that suggests something too constructive. These abuses are varieties of vandalism and nihilism, procedural moves in the tit-for-tat destruction of liberal democracy, committed by partisans dedicated to no principle other than keeping the other party from power. And MAGA isn't mere chaos, but a new moral order based on hierarchy, dominance and submission to authority. But so we're watching the construction of an alternative value system, where democratic norms, constitutional constraints, and even basic factual reality are treated as obstacles to be demolished rather than foundations to be preserved. And Trump has for years made no secret of his disregard for the limits of his power and is governing accordingly. And these are the kinds of things we could one day look back upon as recasting the balance of power in American government and pushing us in a more authoritarian direction. And CNN is literally cataloging the authoritarian moves, and we're still operating as if this is normal political combat. And you need to understand the stakes for 2026 specifically, because the stakes are much higher for Trump, who doesn't want to see his agenda stymied by a Democratic House, and is also nervous about the prospect of a possible third impeachment. So this isn't just about winning seats, this is about a desperate bid for self-preservation, because California Governor Gavin Newsom warned that the claims of violence and use of troops are a preview of things to come, and that ICE and Border Patrol will be showing up at voting booths or polling places, and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker warned that Trump would like to stop the elections in 2026, or take control of those elections, claiming there's some problem with an election, and then using troops on the ground to take control. And I need you to understand that governors from both parties are not engaging in hyperbole. They are reading the same signals that this economist read. They're seeing the same authoritarian trajectory. What's happening right now is the ground is being prepared for mass rejection of election results, and Trump's pardons of Rudy Giuliani and other election deniers are a reminder that the 2026 midterms will face an extraordinary new source of pressure: the federal government itself. Even if the administration never charges any officials, the threat alone of criminal investigation or prosecution will likely exacerbate the exodus of election officials from their jobs, and in 2024, 33% of local election officials knew at least one colleague who resigned at least in part due to fear for their safety. So you're systematically destroying the infrastructure of electoral administration through intimidation, and an election official fearful of criminal charges might succumb to pressure to aggressively purge voters from the rolls or to engage in outright election subversion. And an election official facing the prospect of prosecution now might not take the same principled stand that officials like Brad Raffensperger took in 2020. And this is how you corrupt the system from within. You make the people who administer elections too terrified to do their jobs with integrity. The Economist's prediction about economic fearmongering is already materializing because President Trump says this election is all about affordability, but calls it a hoax. Yet other Republican leaders say the upcoming midterm election is all about affordability, and they're trying to present a plan to creating a real disconnect because when House Speaker Mike Johnson was asked if Republicans have a messaging problem, he had to say there's just been so much to message. So even within the Republican coalition, there's recognition that they have catastrophically failed on the economy. But Trump's instinct is to deny reality entirely and instead construct an alternative narrative where the economy is perfect and anyone saying otherwise is engaged in a conspiracy. And this is classic authoritarian epistemology, where truth becomes whatever the leader says it is. Trump himself called the affordability issue a scam and a con job by Democrats at a cabinet meeting. And the day after a special election defeat, Trump said that affordability is a Democrat hoax, while simultaneously his own party is panicking about losing on exactly that issue. The fire and brimstone prediction is so apt because fascism, an authoritarian and nationalistic political ideology, often capitalizes on fear and prejudice to gain power, and fascist leaders exploit societal anxieties by promising security, stability, and a return to a perceived golden age, and fascists in Italy and Nazis in Germany exploited fears and anxieties and economic crises. The instability brought by WWI and strong nationalist and militarist feelings created an environment ideally suited to their demagoguery. These events generated palpable fear and anxiety among landowners and some elites, as well as among many middle-class Italians, and many elites came to view traditional center-right parties as ineffective in stopping socialism and started to turn to fascists. So the pattern is consistent across every fascist movement. You manufacture or exploit a crisis, usually economic. You identify a scapegoat, usually some marginalized population, and then you position yourself as the only force capable of restoring order. And we are watching this play out in real time with the targeting of immigrants, the demonization of progressive movements, the constant invocation of civilizational collapse. And here's where the current political environment gets truly dangerous, because Donald Trump has orchestrated a years-long campaign of dehumanization and demagoguery of immigrants, and establishing a particular group as the other is often a tool of those seeking to consolidate power and establish authoritarian rule. And since January, Trump has wasted no time testing the boundaries of the groundwork he laid, unleashing cruel and unlawful enforcement tactics against immigrant communities, and by calling up the National Guard and deploying Marines on the streets of Los Angeles, in express opposition to the will of California's governor, the president has critically raised the stakes, and this is the authoritarian playbook. And if left unchecked, the administration will wield its consolidated power against anyone with whom they disagree. And the National Immigration Law Center is documenting this as a road to authoritarianism being built on the backs of immigrants, which is precisely how fascist movements operate. They test their methods on the most vulnerable populations first, and then expand the repression outward. The Economist said they'll weave economics with fear, and fear is the method most often used by politicians to increase the power of government. And the government's endless jabbering about terrorism amounts to little more than propaganda. The propaganda of fear, a tactic used to terrorize, cower, and control the population. Fear leads to fascistic totalitarian regimes. Fear prevents us from thinking. The emotional panic that accompanies fear actually shuts down the prefrontal cortex, or the rational thinking part of our brains, and a populace that stops thinking for themselves is a populace that is easily led, easily manipulated, and easily controlled. So the mechanism is biological, not just political. When you keep a population in a constant state of threat activation, their capacity for rational deliberation literally decreases, and they become more susceptible to authoritarian solutions. And this is why a constant drumbeat of invasion rhetoric, the endless catastrophizing about woke policies, the apocalyptic framing of every election is not just rhetorical excess, it's a deliberate strategy to keep voters in a state of amygdala hijack, where fear overrides reason. What we're witnessing, as The Economist correctly diagnosed, is a fundamental nihilism about democratic governance itself, where Trump has sent National Guard troops to Los Angeles and Washington, named other cities run by Democrats as targets for military intervention, or deployed masked and unidentifiable agents in immigration raids, explicitly threatened Chicago with a military invasion, and used government power to persecute his perceived political enemies, but many journalistic outlets have yet to call him what he is. An authoritarian. Journalistic norms of independence can pressure even ethical journalists into acquiescence to competitive authoritarianism because they want to avoid looking partisan, when all coverage that falls outside the authoritarian's approved message gets characterized as resistance, so the media itself becomes complicit not through malice, but through the very norms that are supposed to protect objectivity. A competitive authoritarian leader will use their leverage to influence what should be independent journalism, and we've already seen this with settlements and self-censorship. The 2026 prediction is not speculative, it's based on current observable actions because President Trump wants to change the way Americans vote before the 2026 midterms, and Trump has taken a top-down approach to altering election practices a year out from the November 30, 2026 elections, which will determine whether Trump has congressional support for his agenda. Trump's actions have alarmed election officials who vow to protect the rights of voters, and officials say they're confident they'll have safe, free, and secure elections in 2026. But it is going to be up to state and local election officials because the federal government right now is not being supportive, and indeed is targeting election officials, so you have state officials essentially preparing for siege conditions where they have to defend the electoral process against the federal government itself, and Trump's actions could affect the 2026 midterm elections, and what it will mean for voters is an open question, but the direction of travel is unmistakable, and we need to be absolutely clear about what ruling by fear means in practice, because Trump said those on the radical left compared wonderful Americans to Nazis and the world's worst mass murderers. This kind of rhetoric is directly responsible for terrorism. He held the radical left responsible for terrorism in the country, and Trump has created fear for any person or group he considers his opposition, and there is fear among migrants, green card holders, and even U.S. citizens of being arrested by ICE officers and deported, fear at universities of losing control over academic freedom and government grants, fear at foundations of losing tax-free status, fear among political commentators and late-night hosts of losing freedom of speech, fear among journalists not working for outlets like Fox News of expressing their opinions, fear among academics at museums, at cultural centers, and this catalog of fear is not paranoia. It's documentation of the actual chilling effect that's already operating across civil society. Autocrats, the world over, have long used baseless allegations of terrorism and violence to go after nonprofits that do not bow to their authority in order to break down civil societies that pose a fundamental threat to their power and control. And Democracy Docket is tracking this as Trump's authoritarian push. So when The Economist says Trump will rule by fear in 2026 and play the fear card really big and weave it in with economics, saying if we lose control it'll be a disaster, the economy will tank, we'll have woke policies, you'll be unemployed, it'll be fire and brimstone, he's describing exactly what Trump has. Historically bad poll numbers, but the White House's 2026 midterm strategy will run through Trump himself while trying to recreate the energy behind his 2024 campaign, and Trump's chief of staff revealed the White House has flipped its strategy for the 2026 midterm elections and will make the president campaign like it's 2024 in the hope of avoiding a coast-to-coast wipeout, and Trump would effectively be on the ballot. So voters turned up to ensure the GOP kept control of Congress, so they're going all in on the only strategy they have left, which is maximum polarization, maximum fear, maximum claims of existential threat, because the whole endgame in 2026 is to get Trump voters out to vote again. These are his voters, and no one is better at turning out those voters than Donald J. Trump. And the mechanism for turning them out will be precisely what The Economist predicted: unrelenting catastrophic fear-mongering about what happens if the other side wins. This is not politics as usual, and we need to stop pretending it is, because with the growing possibility of a Democratic victory in the midterms, there could be more overt threats on voting day itself, and the greatest worry is that the big lie of 2020 is not simply a test or disinformation, but is a jumping-off point for the worst-case scenario, where a desperate Trump tries to make sure the midterms 2026 don't even take place, including a scenario where Republicans do not accept a defeat in the midterms or generate some event like the Reichstag fire. And political scientists are literally gaming out scenarios based on historical fascist playbooks where manufactured crises are used to suspend democratic processes. We're supposed to just treat this as one more election cycle, one more round of partisan bickering, when in fact what's at stake is whether we continue to have free and fair elections at all. The Economist's final point about nihilism is the most devastating, because when you don't fundamentally believe in markets or government, when your approach is nihilistic, what you're really saying is that power is the only currency that matters, not constitutional norms, not democratic legitimacy, not even economic rationality, just raw power and the capacity to wield it. And in a competitive authoritarian system, a leader comes to power democratically and then erodes the system of checks and balances by filling the civil service and key appointments with loyalists, then attacks the media, universities, and non-governmental organizations to blunt public criticism and tilt the electoral playing field in the ruling party's favor. And that is precisely the trajectory we are on right now in December 2025. And if we don't name it, if we don't resist it, if we continue to treat this as just another election, we will wake up one day and realize we no longer live in a democracy, and the opportunity to prevent that outcome will have passed, and everything that The Economist warned about will have come to pass, and we will have no one to blame but ourselves for failing to sound the alarm loud enough and fight back hard enough while there was still time.